Chris Bowen has quit Twitter, or X, giving new meaning to the nickname Blackout Bowen. He has left for the allegedly greener pastures of the blue sky echo chamber. Chris Bowen claimed that X is, quote, no longer the place for informed and respectful conversation. And of course, on the topic of Twitter or X, you can follow this channel's X account, which I'll link to in the comments below. I don't really post there very much, largely because they don't want to have to pay for 2 lots of Twitter verified, but nevertheless you can follow me. I should try to post some more, and hopefully we can get some engagement there as well. Now of course, with this in mind, one might wonder what type of informed or respectful conversation was Chris Bowen himself actually engaging in. And it turns out there wasn't much conversation at all, with most of the posts being a one-way street, but also it wasn't necessarily that informed to begin with. Now Chris Bowen had previously argued, or stated, that he didn't really read the comments on his Twitter or X posts because it was bad for his mental health. Though I can understand why that might be the case. Many of the comments about him and what he was saying were rather negative and quite strident. But of course that's the case for any politician. We can all remember perhaps the feedback that Scott Morrison has rightly or wrongly received. Nevertheless, Chris Bowen was treated much like any other politician. Now in terms of what type of content he was putting out, a lot of it was very negative toward Peter Dutton. Now of course that's not surprising, they were in opposite political parties. Some of it, however, was much less informed and constructive than others. For example, he'd put up various memes and comments about Peter Dutton's nuclear plan. Some of those were well justified, some of them were not. The Labour Party itself had form putting out some rather interesting memes, for example. For example, there was the one coming out from Andrew Lee, which depicted Blinky Bill with 3 eyes. There was the one coming out from Jacinta Allen's team, which depicted a fish with 3 eyes swimming out of Gippsland. Then there's the one coming out of the Unions, which suggested that under Peter Dutton, a rather ugly-looking slug would be your new family dog, arguing or insinuating that under the nuclear plan, your dog would morph into this monstrous-looking creation. Now, in terms of other constructive content Chris Bowen put out, well, there was of course his rather cringe-worthy conversation. I should put conversation in inverted commas here, between himself and a staffer. It stated, "Hey boss, new ABS data out today shows that our government's energy bill rebates helps lower energy bills by 6.4%. Without them, bills would have gone up and Aussie homes and businesses would be paying more. Want me to post about it on your social media?" To which Chris Bowen seemingly responds, "Good stuff. Yeah, post it right away. Thanks, mate." Now, I'll put this into $100 for things that never happened, to begin with. Secondly, if we actually dig a little bit into this, it highlights that Chris Bowen's staffer was putting out the content onto his social media, implying Chris Bowen wasn't actually doing this to begin with, meaning that he wouldn't be the one engaging in any of this so-called constructive conversation or debate to begin with. So it's not quite clear what his problem was with Twitter or X, if he wasn't even actually managing or engaging with or reading his account. Nevertheless, it tells us that he wasn't really engaging in much conversation, so much as putting up various tweets and quips about Peter Dutton and the nuclear plan. Now, of course, Twitter can be rather strident, and some of the comments on Twitter can be a little bit negative and aggressive. And indeed, Chris Bowen was repeatedly community noted on Twitter or X, i.e. people going on correcting what he was saying. But this then leads me onto a couple of issues. The first one, of course, being that the Labour government has not exactly been engaging in constructive communication, constructive conversation, or open debate itself. Let's think of a few examples. So we think back to the voice referendum, albeit more than a year ago at this point. We can all remember that Anthony Albanese claimed that people were chicken littles if they doubted the referendum. He also claimed that it was just an outstretched hand, an open gesture, a gesture of goodwill and reconciliation, which itself was misleading and not constructive conversation, because the voice would have been given power to make representations to Parliament and the executive, and with that right comes the ability to be informed about anything the decisions were going to be, and therefore the ability to be proactively contacted about decisions. They effectively would have been the only people in the room when decisions were being made or when people were being consulted. Not only that, they would have had funding from the Commonwealth Government. No other entity would have had the right to funding and access. And if you're the only person in the room, the only person who is partaking in the conversation, the only side of the debate being listened to, you have de facto or constructive power. The Voice would have had power, but Anthony Albanese decided to gaslight us about whether it would. Then there's the debate about the Uluru Statement, which Anthony Albanese claimed was one page, in an attempt to obfuscate about exactly what the Voice would lead to. Now, as that Uluru Statement stated, well, the Voice would have been the prelude toward a Makarrata Commission and to so-called truth. That truth, of course, would have just been an Orwellian word for one particular group's source of truth, and not necessarily actually the objective truth. Nevertheless, it would have called for this Makarrata Commission and for a treaty. Now, this begs the question of what a treaty would involve, and Peter Credlin, to her credit, did some digging and found that it might involve things such as reparations, and she discovered a more fulsome 26-page version of the Uluru Statement. There was debate about exactly how long the Uluru Statement is. Anthony Albanese wanted to gaslight us and say it was one page, however that was patently false because the words in that one page needed definition. Now, the sum total of this is not to relitigate the Voice, but to highlight that the government has itself engaged in misleading and, to my mind, deceptive communication. And that's just one example. Then there's other examples about what Jim Chalmers is doing. Jim Chalmers has claimed that every Australian has gotten a tax cut under his administration. That is false. The prior government had legislated for larger tax cuts. The current government had amended that legislation to reduce the tax cuts. In essence, both A, the tax cuts were passed under the Morrison government, and B, to the extent that the Anthony Albanese government engaged in any changes, they actually engaged in a tax hike. Jim Chalmers is objectively misleading people. That's not constructive conversation. That's just misleading. Furthermore, every time he goes around saying there's GDP growth or the economy is powering along, he's neatly glossing over the fact that GDP per person has fallen for 7 consecutive quarters, and productivity has gone backwards. Jim Chalmers has effectively been trying to engage in what I would call earnings management in the corporate sector, i.e. trying to make the current books of the current figures look good, trying to create a current surplus, knowing full well that this is going to reverse into a deficit, but that will only occur after the next election. The same logic applies with subsidies, which have artificially driven down inflation right now, but do nothing to reverse month-on-month or quarter-on-quarter inflation, and indeed would reverse in a year's time, which conveniently happens to be after the federal election. In essence, it's an attempt to create a facade of good economic growth or of inflation going down, when in fact that isn't what is happening. And when we're focusing on this surplus, what it does tell us is that the government has lucked into a high commodity price at the moment and high taxation. Taxes as a share of GDP have gone up significantly, and the government doesn't seem to want to do anything about that, and indeed they're going to make it worse with things like their superannuation tax grab. What they really need to be doing is cutting capital gains tax, because cutting capital gains tax will enable people to invest and therefore achieve freedom from both the government and from the corporation. Enabling people to invest and earn money from those investments is the surefire way to let people keep more of their own capital, whether people are investing themselves or they're getting a fund manager to do so. Investing is how people can get ahead and not have to be slaves to their corporation. And that investing can involve things such as simple as going around and getting an ASX 200 exchange-traded fund, and need not be complicated. But the Albanese government seems to want to increase taxes generally, and is particularly increasing capital gains tax on superannuation through Division 296. The Albanese government seemingly wants to tax people more, and seemingly doesn't want people to keep more of their own hard-earned money. And indeed, if we cut capital gains tax to say 15%, what would happen? Well, people would perhaps trade more, they would invest more, and as a result, people would both A, keep more of their own money because capital gains tax would be lower, but not only that, because people would be trading more, it would actually potentially increase the tax take for the government, especially if we do away with the need to wait 1 year and a day to get the capital gains tax discount of 25%. Because if people get 15% right now, they won't need to hold something for a year and a day. What they can do is they can trade it after a month, whether it be a property or be a share. And this means the government can both A, earn more money, and B, enable people to keep more of their own money. It's win-win. But the government at the moment seemingly doesn't want to enable people to create their own wealth. It wants people to be indentured servants to the government. So the whole Albanese government has been misleading itself. Not only that, they've tried to stymie constructive conversation through their misinformation and disinformation bill, which effectively would have amounted to online censorship. Online censorship because the definition of misinformation was so broad, it would have captured whatever social media companies deemed to be misleading content, which could have been almost anything because it was incredibly broad. It would have left it up to social media companies, and those social media companies would have been penalized if they were subsequently found to have failed to suppress what the government determined to be misinformation. But they wouldn't have been penalized if they suppressed too much information. It clearly would have incentivized social media companies to go around and censor people. That's what the net effect of that censorship or the misinformation and disinformation bill would have been. But that was seemingly actually part of the point. The government wanted more control over online dialogue, not an actual genuine conversation. So if we circle this back around to Chris Bowen, well, it appears his decision to leave Twitter or X is not really that much to do with constructive conversation. Rather, it appears to be that he couldn't always get his own way on Twitter or X. People could actually disagree with him on Twitter or X. It wasn't just that he could put out a narrative and expect people to accept it uncritically. He would be criticized. So he has moved to Blue Sky, which is effectively just an echo chamber at this point in time. He's seemingly moving away from Twitter or X into an area where conservatives are themselves pushed out of Blue Sky and have reportedly been removed from Blue Sky through various, I'll call them unconstructive, reports about them. He's moving over to just a group of people that are going to uncritically accept whatever he says. But of course, Blue Sky is a relatively small platform. He's giving up a large audience by leaving Twitter/X. And to some extent, that might be a good thing. Now, whether or not this shifts the needle when it comes to election time remains to be seen. I suspect that Australian voters probably aren't going to take kindly to a politician running away from debate and criticism of his own policies that are making life worse for them. For example, in Chris Bowen's own remit, we need look no further than the ute tax, which would increase the prices of many of Australia's most popular vehicles. His policies would increase costs for Australians and make life worse for Australians. Him running away from criticism probably isn't going to sit well come election time. But let me know your thoughts about Chris Bowen leaving Twitter or X in the comments below. And if you're interested, you can follow this channel's Twitter account. I don't really post very much, but you can follow it there nevertheless. And hopefully I see you next time as well.